In the long list of war criminals of the Third Reich, few names provoke as much horror as that of Josef Mengele. Known as the Angel of Death, Mengele was the doctor who personified cruelty disguised as science. During the Second World War, he became a central figure in Auschwitz, the most lethal concentration camp of the Nazi regime. There, Mengele selected the prisoners who would be sent to the gas chambers and decided who would live only to be subjected to unimaginable medical experiments, mutilations, deliberate infections, tortures disguised as research, and studies on twins in order to support Nazi racial ideology. His obsession with racial purity and perfection turned thousands of innocent people into mere human guinea pigs. But when the Third Reich collapsed, Mengele managed to escape and disappear for decades, protected by networks of sympathizers and his own cunning. Today, we will explore the story of this man who brought medicine into the service of terror, a journey through the biography of Josef Mengele, the most sinister face of Auschwitz, the darkest side of the Angel of Death, Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele was born in 1911 in the German city of Günzburg. He studied medicine and anthropology, earning a doctorate with research on genetics and heredity. During the Second World War, he joined the feared SS and was assigned to the Auschwitz concentration camp. During the Second World War, he was stationed at the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he was responsible for prisoner selections and led cruel medical experiments, especially with twin children. His practices included mutilations, lethal injections, and procedures without anesthesia under the pretext of scientific research. On the 27th of January of 1945, the forces of the Red Army finally crossed the electrified fences surrounding Auschwitz, the largest and deadliest of all the concentration and extermination camps that the Nazi regime had built in occupied Poland. That day revealed to the Soviet soldiers a panorama of horror so profound that it defied any limit of human comprehension. During the 5 years it operated, from 1940 to 1945, it is estimated that approximately 1,300,000 men, women and children were deported to this complex. Of them, nearly 1,100,000 perished in a scenario of planned death carried out with chilling bureaucratic rigor. Gas chambers fed with Zyklon B, firing squads, deliberate starvation and exhaustion unto death. Despite the magnitude of the extermination, a small group managed to stay alive until the end. That same day in January, Soviet soldiers liberated just over 7,000 prisoners who remained there abandoned. Most were in deplorable physical condition, consumed by chronic malnutrition, disease, and systematic abuse. Many could barely stand, and their appearance resembled spectral beings more than human ones. Among the barracks and storage buildings, the liberators found harrowing evidence of crimes whose brutality defied all notions of civilization. Mountains of unburied corpses, personal belongings sorted by origin and size, and meticulous records that attested to a machinery of annihilation planned down to the last detail. Among the survivors were dozens of people who had been victims of atrocious medical experiments conceived under the guise of scientific research, but which in reality were nothing more than trials of cruelty disguised as progress. At the heart of that nightmare, one name stood out as the emblem of absolute perversity: Josef Mengele, the doctor who would become known worldwide as the Angel of Death. Mengele had been born on the 16th of March of 1911 in Günzburg, a small Bavarian town that at the time was part of the German Empire. He was the eldest son of Karl Mengele, a prosperous industrialist and owner of a thriving business dedicated to the production of agricultural machinery. Thanks to his family's comfortable economic position, Josef received a careful education from childhood, which fueled his ambition and interest in the natural sciences. From his early years, he experienced a deep fascination with biology and medical studies, disciplines that in interwar Germany were taking on an increasingly ideological character. His academic career took him through several German universities, where he not only received high-level technical training, but also absorbed, like many young people of his generation, the racial theories that were spreading with growing virulence. In 1935, Mengele earned his doctorate in physical anthropology at the University of Munich. The following year, he passed the state exams that qualified him to practice medicine, consolidating a dual profile that combined scientific research with clinical practice. Both facets, the physician and the anthropologist, would eventually intertwine in a sinister way when Nazism offered Mengele the perfect stage to bring his obsessions to life. In 1937, Josef Mengele began his career as a scientific researcher at one of the most influential institutions of racial thought in the Third Reich, the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. There he worked under the supervision of Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, a prestigious geneticist in the German academic world, but also a fervent supporter of eugenics and the racial improvement policies promoted by the Nazi regime. Von Verschuer led studies on twins with the intention of deciphering the mechanisms of genetic inheritance. The ultimate purpose of these investigations was not merely scientific, but political and social, to identify the laws governing the transmission of hereditary traits in order to purify the German social body of elements considered degenerative. Within that ideological framework, the collective health of the German people was conceived as a biological matter that had to be monitored, regulated, and, if necessary, subjected to radical measures. Mengele, deeply impressed by these ideas, quickly became a close collaborator and favored disciple of Verschuer. Under his direction, he completed in 1938 a second doctorate, this time in human genetics and eugenics, in which he addressed issues related to the hereditary transmission of physical and pathological characteristics. The apparent scientific rigor of these studies, however, concealed a much more sinister objective: to support, with an academic veneer, the racial ideology that underpinned the policies of the Third Reich. Although during the early years of the rise of the National Socialist Party, Mengele did not stand out for visible political activism, the academic and scientific environment in which he moved was saturated with racist ideas presented as scientific truths. The so-called racial biology became the common language of many disciplines, from anthropology to medicine, and offered supposed empirical foundations to justify discrimination, exclusion, and later, the extermination of entire peoples. This pseudoscience mixed ancestral prejudices with distorted biological concepts, constructing a racial hierarchy in which the Germanic peoples occupied the top, while Jews, Slavs, Romani, and other groups were considered biologically inferior and therefore a constant threat to the purity and vitality of the German people. In this poisoned intellectual atmosphere, Mengele found not only legitimacy for his ambitions, but also an ideological system that would give meaning to his future actions. Mengele fervently assimilated the racial doctrine that permeated the scientific thought of his time and, over time, turned it into the very core of his professional identity. His academic career and ideological commitment ceased to be separate compartments. They merged into a single life project aimed at providing scientific legitimacy to the most extreme policies of the National Socialist regime. The so-called racial science conferred a veneer of academic respectability on practices of unprecedented brutality. The forced sterilization of people with physical or mental disabilities, systematic segregation, social exclusion, and ultimately, the industrialized murder of millions of human beings found in this ideology a supposedly rational foundation. The Nuremberg laws, enacted in 1935, which prohibited any marital union or sexual relationship between Germans and Jews, Romani or black people found in the biological discourses of institutions like the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute an apparently scientific justification that sought to make them unquestionable. In 1938, Mengele took a crucial step in his commitment to Nazism. He formally joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, and became a member of the Schutzstaffel, better known as the SS. This paramilitary organization, led by Heinrich Himmler, was much more than a repressive apparatus. It constituted the main instrument for the surveillance, planning, and execution of the racial utopia of the Third Reich. Membership in the SS not only provided him with prestige and a fast track to rise within the state hierarchy, but also allowed him to position himself exactly at the intersection where biomedical research became state policy. Following his affiliation, Mengele began to assume responsibilities that intertwined his academic training with the practical application of racist ideology. He participated in anthropological assessments that determined whether an individual could be considered racially pure according to the criteria established by the Nuremberg laws. He signed reports that endorsed the compulsory sterilization of people labeled as carriers of hereditary defects. He prepared documents that discouraged marriages considered detrimental to the national community. All this reinforced his prestige among the high ranks of the SSS and consolidated his reputation as a scientist committed to the Nazi biopolitical project. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Mengele already held a privileged position. His experience in genetics, ideological loyalty, and personal ambition made him an ideal candidate to carry out tasks that combined medical research and the implementation of racial policies in occupied territories. The conflict presented him with an unprecedented opportunity. The conquered territories offered a virtually inexhaustible supply of defenseless victims, considered human material available for study and experimentation. In 1943, culminating a path marked by the collusion between science and fanaticism, Mengele received his final assignment, the Auschwitz concentration and extermination camp. There, his name would forever be associated with the cruelest experiments and the most extreme version of contempt for human life. At Auschwitz, Mengele found the perfect stage to consummate the symbiosis between his scientific ambitions and the unlimited authority granted to him by his rank within the SS. That extermination complex, conceived for the systematic destruction of entire communities, was transformed under his direction into a vast laboratory where human suffering was reduced to a variable of experimentation. For approximately 2 years, Mengele exercised absolute power over the lives and deaths of tens of thousands of prisoners. In his daily routine, the selections on the ramp took place, where with a simple gesture he indicated who would live a few more weeks and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. Exhaustive examinations of children and adults to classify them according to their scientific usefulness, and procedures that in reality were nothing but torture disguised with false academic rigor. His research on identical twins aimed to demonstrate, according to him, the hereditary laws that sustained racial purity. For this, he extracted blood in excessive quantities, amputated limbs without justification, and subjected children to atrocious surgical interventions, many of which were fatal. Lethal injections, dissections performed on prisoners while still alive, and the collection of human organs and eyes were part of a catalogue of horrors whose logic rested on the conviction that those victims lacked dignity. For Mengele, the entire camp represented a testing ground where any ethical limit was abolished. In January of 1945, the Red Army advanced through Poland and surrounded Auschwitz. Faced with the imminent arrival of Soviet troops, Mengele and other SS members fled in haste, abandoning the camp. When the Soviet soldiers crossed the electrified fences on the 27th of January, they discovered a scene that exceeded any expectation. Among piled corpses and barracks turned into ruins, they found more than 7,000 survivors, human beings reduced to specters by hunger, disease, and abuse. Many barely retained the strength to sit up. In the meticulous record of documents, surgical instruments, and materials preserved in laboratory jars, the liberators found irrefutable evidence of the experiments perpetrated under Mengele's supervision. The testimonies of the survivors provided horrifying details: children sewn together, pregnant women used as guinea pigs, twins murdered after being examined to the point of exhaustion. Thus, when the true extent of his crimes was exposed to the eyes of the world, the perversity of the system he had embodied was revealed, a mechanism of systematic violence, legitimized by a corrupted scientific discourse, which pursued the total destruction of entire peoples in the name of a homicidal ideology. The true story of Josef Mengele and his inhuman experiments. Josef Mengele's only son, named Rolf, came into the world in 1944, when the war was already in its most devastating phase. Years earlier, in 1939, Mengele had married Irene Schönbein, a bond that was consolidated shortly before the European continent plunged into the deadliest conflict in history. The Second World War broke out on the 1st of September of that year, with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, an act of aggression that marked the beginning of an unprecedented period of violence. In June of 1940, Mengele was called up by the Wehrmacht, the regular armed forces of the Reich. However, his career would soon take a darker turn. Barely a month after his recruitment, he volunteered to serve in the medical corps of the Waffen-SS, the militarized branch of the feared SS, which combined combat duties with the enforcement of Nazi racial ideology. At first, Mengele was assigned to the SS Main Race and Settlement Office, deployed in German-occupied Poland. There he was responsible for inspecting the methods used to determine whether those claiming to be of Bavarian lineage met the racial and physical conditions required to be recognized as full Germans. These supposedly scientific evaluations served as the basis for accepting or rejecting entire families within the racial hierarchy of the Third Reich. On the 22nd of June of 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. During the 18 months that followed the start of the offensive, Mengele took part in military operations on the Eastern Front, where some of the fiercest and most ruthless fighting of the entire war occurred. The units of the division to which he belonged were involved in massacres against the Jewish civilian population in the occupied territories. In the early weeks of the campaign, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were summarily executed. Mengele not only carried out medical duties, but also distinguished himself through acts of bravery on the battlefield. In an episode that earned him recognition among his superiors, he rescued 2 German soldiers trapped inside a burning tank. For this action, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and later First Class, one of Germany's most prestigious military honors. He was also promoted to the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer, equivalent to the rank of captain within the SS. In January of 1943, Mengele returned to Germany, where he awaited his next assignment within the Waffen-SS. During this waiting period, he resumed his collaboration with his former mentor, Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, who had recently assumed leadership of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics and Eugenics in Berlin. This institute was a hub of the Reich's eugenic research and provided an ideal environment to continue his scientific ambitions. Finally, on the 30th of May of 1943, Mengele received the order that would change the course of his life and seal his infamy. His destination would be the Auschwitz complex. There, he joined the medical corps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the part of the camp that functioned both as an internment center and as a site of mass extermination. There is strong evidence that Mengele himself voluntarily requested this assignment, attracted by the limitless possibilities it offered for his experiments on human beings. Auschwitz-Birkenau had become the primary setting of the Nazi genocide. Each week, Trains arrived with thousands of Jewish deportees from every corner of occupied Europe. Most were murdered immediately upon stepping off the wagons, while a minority were selected for forced labor or to be part of medical studies. In his capacity as camp doctor, Mengele assumed responsibilities that went far beyond clinical practice. He supervised the so-called selections on the arrival ramps, where he decided at a glance who would be sent to the gas chambers and who would be temporarily spared. He also played a central role in administering the Romani family camp, a specific section of Birkenau designated for interning Romani men, women, and children. Starting in 1943, around 21,000 Roma were deported to Auschwitz and confined to that sector. For months, Mengele inspected this camp and studied its inmates with the same relentless approach he applied to the other prisoners. On the 2nd of August of 1944, when the Nazi High Command decided to liquidate that section, Mengele intervened directly in the final selection of the Romani prisoners. That night, 2,893 men, women and children were sent to their deaths in the gas chambers of Birkenau. Mengele's trajectory at Auschwitz synthesizes the perverse union of racist ideology, scientific ambition, and absolute power over life and death. His actions turned his name into a universal symbol of horror and of the extremes that human cruelty can reach when it cloaks itself in authority and hides behind the language of science. Shortly after his arrival at Auschwitz, Josef Mengele was promoted to the position of chief physician of the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. By the end of 1944, he was also assigned to the SS hospital in Birkenau, where his authority became fully consolidated. Among his many duties, the so-called selections became one of the deadliest and most emblematic procedures of the camp. These selections consisted of identifying those prisoners who, in the opinion of the SS doctors, no longer had the strength required to work. The fate of those deemed useless was sealed. They would be eliminated, as they were considered to consume resources that should be reserved for the fit. Each time a transport of Jews arrived at Birkenau, the medical staff, Mengele among them, examined the new arrivals. Only a few adults, those who appeared physically capable, were set aside for forced labor. The rest, elderly people, the sick children and pregnant women, were led directly to the gas chambers. The process was relentless and allowed no appeals. Especially tragic was the fate reserved for mothers with babies or small children. As soon as they stepped off the train cars, these women and their children were selected for immediate execution. Mengele justified these decisions with chilling reasoning. According to him, freeing a Jewish child was impossible since there was no longer any place where Jews could live in freedom. Keeping them in the camp was also not viable, as there were no facilities that could ensure their development. In his twisted view, sending a child alone to the gas chamber was a greater act of cruelty, so he preferred that the child die accompanied by their mother. Thus, he argued, the mother could at least hold them until the final moment. Aside from his medical duties, rumors surrounded his private life. Some testimonies claimed that Mengele had a romantic relationship with Irma Grese, one of the most feared female guards at Auschwitz, known for her sadism. However, it is said that when Mengele discovered that Grese was engaging in sexual relations with Jewish inmates who were considered subhuman, he ended his relationship with her. It was also said that Mengele had a pathological attraction to sexual violence. According to some accounts, on one occasion he spent an entire night observing and recording the reactions of Jewish women who were being raped by camp personnel. This behavior, which today would be classified as criminal perversion, contributed to the image of Mengele as a man whose sadism exceeded the boundaries of any imaginable ethics. Selections did not only occur on the arrival ramp. The medical staff under his supervision conducted periodic inspections in the barracks and infirmaries to identify prisoners who were injured, gravely ill, or too weak. These visits were feared with a dread that is hard to describe. Victims knew that a single glance could seal their fate. Those selected could be killed by lethal phenol injections directly into the heart or sent to the gas chambers. It was precisely this arbitrariness that earned Mengele the nickname the Angel of Death. For those who lived under his authority, his figure embodied the constant threat of immediate and unjustified death. Jewish gynecologist Gisela Perl, who worked in the women's infirmary at Birkenau, would later recall that Mengele's inspections provoked the deepest terror. Her words convey the desperation of those days. "We feared his visits more than anything else because we never knew if we would live to see the sunrise again. He had absolute power to decide who would live and who would be exterminated." In the summer of 1943, a typhus epidemic spread through the women's barracks. Mengele ordered an entire block where 600 Jewish women were housed to be emptied. All of them were sent without hesitation to the gas chambers. Afterwards, he ordered the barracks to be cleaned and disinfected, while the women from the neighboring block were instructed to bathe and put on clean clothes before being transferred to the newly purified space. This procedure was repeated with scrupulous regularity every time a typhus, scarlet fever, or other infectious disease outbreak occurred. Thus, under the pretext of sanitary prevention, Mengele consolidated a system that combined extermination, discipline, and pseudo-medical experimentation. His time at Auschwitz is remembered as one of the darkest chapters of the Holocaust. Every decision he made, justified by medical authority and racial fanaticism, resulted in the death of thousands of innocents. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, mass extermination was not only a consequence of Nazi ideological fanaticism, but also a carefully structured practice. Whenever an epidemic outbreak occurred, whether typhus, scarlet fever, or other infectious diseases, the camp authorities immediately activated a rigid protocol. Infected prisoners were identified, separated from the others, and led without delay to the gas chambers. This measure, officially presented as a sanitary necessity to prevent the spread of disease, in reality concealed a policy of systematic elimination. Thus, mass murder was institutionalized under the guise of public hygiene, in a logic as perverse as it was efficient. This death logic, repeated with administrative coldness, formed part of the camp's daily machinery. The supposed epidemic prevention was nothing more than another euphemism by which the SS concealed the selective extermination of the weak and the sick. The barracks were emptied, disinfected, and new prisoners took their place. A routine that, under its apparent rationality, hid the most absolute contempt for human life. After the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, the name Josef Mengele emerged as one of the most sinister emblems of Nazi barbarism. Unlike other high-ranking members of the camp's medical staff, Mengele did not hold the highest post, nor was he the supreme chief of Auschwitz's medical personnel. However, his figure achieved a prominent place in the collective memory of the Holocaust due to the atrocious nature of his acts and the profound impact they had on his victims. It was the voice of the survivors, especially those subjected to his experiments or those who, being prisoner doctors, were forced to collaborate with him, that solidified his infamous reputation. From their testimonies emerged the portrait of a man who practiced science without ethics, guided by racial fanaticism and an absolute disregard for human suffering. Although Mengele was one among nearly 50 doctors who served at Auschwitz, his presence was unusually visible. He frequently appeared on the arrival ramp of the trains where thousands of deportees disembarked, exhausted after days of confinement in freight wagons. Dressed in his impeccably pressed SS uniform and adopting a severe but calm demeanor, he personally supervised the selections. With a simple gesture of the hand, left or right, he decided who lived and who died. Even in cases where he was not responsible for conducting the selections, Mengele often attended, watching closely. He did not do so out of duty, but out of scientific interest. He avidly sought twins, dwarfs, individuals with malformations or particular physical conditions. These prisoners became, in his distorted vision, valuable material for his research on genetics, race, and heredity. The constant arrival of new human transports, more than 1,300,000 men, women, and children of different nationalities and ethnic backgrounds, transformed Auschwitz not only into the largest extermination center of Nazism, but also into a human reservoir for biomedical experimentation. Unlike other concentration camps, Auschwitz offered Nazi doctors an almost unlimited availability of subjects, making it a medical experimentation center without precedent in contemporary history. This unrestricted access to human victims turned Auschwitz into a laboratory of death. For SS doctors who shared the regime's racist ideology, working there represented a unique opportunity. It not only offered the possibility of advancing their personal research, but also of gaining academic and institutional prestige in service of the Third Reich. Josef Mengele was one of at least a dozen doctors who conducted experiments on prisoners in that camp. However, his eagerness to seize this opportunity and the brutality with which he did so made a significant difference. Auschwitz was not only a place for killing, it was also, in the hands of men like Mengele, a grotesque laboratory where science was perverted to serve an ideology of extermination. Auschwitz and the legacy. The experiments carried out at Auschwitz encompassed a chilling range of objectives, from genetic research on twins and dwarfs to trials on the effects of chemical substances and pathogens on the human body. In many cases, the procedures applied caused irreversible mutilations, extreme suffering, and, not infrequently, the death of the victims. Sometimes this death was not a side effect, but the planned outcome, carefully documented by the doctors themselves. It is important to emphasize that none of these practices ever respected the prisoners' consent. No one informed them about the nature of the interventions, their risks, or the fate that awaited them. The most basic notion of medical ethics had been abolished. For Mengele and his colleagues, the inmates of Auschwitz were not human beings worthy of respect, but mere objects on which to experiment in the name of a twisted science in service of National Socialist ideology. Thus, while thousands of people were sent daily to the gas chambers, thousands more were subjected to brutal experiments whose sole purpose was to satisfy the scientific ambition and racial obsession of those who proclaimed themselves heirs to German medicine. The trace of this barbarity remained indelible in the memory of the survivors and would eventually become one of the most overwhelming pieces of evidence of the crimes of the Holocaust. Among the most atrocious practices carried out at Auschwitz was a series of experiments designed with methodical cruelty that defied all notion of humanity. The procedures included evaluating the effectiveness of mass sterilization methods conceived to deprive entire populations of their reproductive capacity. Prisoners were also deliberately wounded or infected with various infectious diseases in order to observe the progression of the illnesses and test possible treatments. Other experiments involved subjecting the inmates to surgical interventions and medical procedures that lacked any therapeutic justification. These operations, in addition to inflicting unbearable suffering, served both investigative purposes and the training of SS doctors and medical personnel. Likewise, prisoners were murdered for the sole purpose of dissecting their bodies and extracting anatomical samples to support the regime's anthropological and medical research projects. It is suspected that Josef Mengele's mentor, Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, played a decisive role in the appointment of his disciple at Auschwitz. It is likely that Verschuer saw in the extermination camp an unparalleled opportunity to supply biological material to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics and Eugenics, of which he was director. During his time at Auschwitz, Mengele sent his colleagues in Germany a sinister inventory of human remains: blood, organs, skeletons, fetuses, and other body parts extracted from murdered prisoners. Mengele did not limit himself to collaborating in his superiors' research projects. He also undertook his own experiments with the intention of producing results that would allow him to build an academic reputation and eventually aspire to a university chair. Under his direction, a research complex was established that occupied several barracks within the camp. For its operation, he carefully selected prisoners with medical training who could assist him in the more technical tasks. Thanks to his position as an SS doctor, he managed to obtain modern surgical instruments, reagents, and laboratory equipment, which he installed in a specific area of Birkenau. He even founded a pathology laboratory where samples taken from the bodies of the murdered were analyzed. The experiments that Josef Mengele carried out at Auschwitz were not solely the result of his personal initiative, but also responded to the interests of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics and Eugenics, directed by his mentor Ottmar von Verschuer. Both in his own studies and in the projects he undertook in collaboration with other regime scientists, the thematic focus revolved around the relationship between genetic inheritance and the manifestation of physical, mental, and behavioral characteristics. In a legitimate scientific environment with ethical principles, human genetics represents a fundamental field of study for understanding the transmission of diseases, biological predispositions, and the evolution of the species. However, within the ideological context of the Third Reich, this discipline was hijacked by political interests and transformed into an instrument of racial propaganda. Mengele and his colleagues were not pursuing scientific truth, but rather the validation of a profoundly racist doctrine that presented biology as a rigid hierarchy of races. The core of this perverted worldview lay in the idea that human races were distinct biological entities, not merely different, but classifiable on a scale of genetic value. According to this logic, the Germanic peoples represented the evolutionary pinnacle. They were supposedly healthier, stronger, and morally superior. At the opposite end were those considered biologically degenerate, Jews, Romani, Slavs, who were believed to have a congenital predisposition to disease, mental weakness, crime, prostitution, and what the Nazis called asocial behaviors. The direct consequence of this theory was the implementation of pseudoscientific and brutally inhuman policies. To preserve the purity of the German gene, racial hygiene measures were promoted, ranging from forced sterilization to the systematic physical elimination of those considered a biological threat. Marriage and reproduction between members of different racial groups were seen as acts of genetic contamination. This obsession with maintaining a supposed racial integrity became one of the ideological pillars of the Nazi genocide. Mengele, fully convinced of this view, fanatically dedicated himself to identifying bodily signs or biochemical indicators that, according to him, could determine an individual's racial background. He sought correlations between physical traits such as skull shape, eye color, height, or facial symmetry, and the ethnic origin of prisoners. He was convinced that biology could offer objective proof for categorizing people according to their racial value. Thus, Auschwitz was not only a center of mass extermination, but also a sinister laboratory where Nazi racial theories were applied with almost religious zeal. Tens of thousands of people, especially children, twins, dwarfs, and prisoners with deformities or rare conditions, were subjected to cruel experiments under the pretense of advancing scientific knowledge that, in reality, was nothing more than an ideological facade. The boundary between science and barbarism dissolved completely, and Mengele became one of its most perverse executors. Mengele shared with other SS-affiliated doctors a conviction that in their view took on the character of a historical urgency. The belief that the safeguarding of the supposed genetic purity of the German people depended on identifying with absolute certainty certain anatomical, physiological, or biochemical traits capable of revealing each individual's racial ancestry. For these men, trained in the rhetoric of racial science and distorted social Darwinism, any discovery that contributed to reinforcing that hierarchical scheme justified without hesitation the use of human beings as experimental subjects. The notion that pain, humiliation, or death might impose limits on such research was entirely devoid of moral relevance. The usefulness of such sacrifices was taken for granted and presented as a necessary step toward knowledge that, according to them, would be decisive for the future of the Reich. The victims who fueled these projects almost always came from two communities to which Nazism assigned the status of essential and perpetual enemies: the Jewish people and the Romani. In the eyes of National Socialist doctrine, Jews and Roma were degraded biological entities, congenital carriers of physical and moral degeneration, an intrinsic danger that had to be eradicated. This belief in absolute inferiority served as the ideological scaffolding for systematic dehumanization. Prisoners were no longer seen as people with dignity, but as expendable material, stripped of any value except that which could be extracted from their suffering. Auschwitz-Birkenau, with its immense scale and meticulously planned organization, offered an unprecedented setting for the practical application of these theories. There, Mengele had at his disposal an uninterrupted supply of victims suited to his interests. During his time at the camp, more than 20,000 Romani were interned in extreme conditions of overcrowding and malnutrition, while convoys from across occupied Europe delivered hundreds of thousands of Jews, subjected to the selection process as soon as they stepped off the train cars. Nowhere else in the world did such a number of defenseless people gather, isolated behind barbed wire and completely subjected to the authority of doctors who claimed the right to decide their fate. Among those electrified fences and the overcrowded barracks filled with exhausted children, Mengele found the ideal environment to merge his ambition for scientific recognition with his fanatical adherence to Nazi ideology. Thus, in improvised dissection rooms, laboratories installed in barracks, and sheds converted into operating theaters, he carried out a catalogue of atrocities that, in his twisted logic, represented the highest service to German science. So convinced was he of the legitimacy of his conduct that he told a colleague that, given the exceptional circumstances of Auschwitz, it would have been almost a crime, in his own words, to pass up such an unrepeatable opportunity to conduct unrestricted research on human beings. His interest in the Roma people was not limited to treating them as mere medical guinea pigs. Mengele also undertook an ambitious anthropological study aimed at meticulously documenting the physical characteristics, customs, and supposed racial peculiarities of this group. During the course of this work, an outbreak of noma, a severe facial gangrene typical of extreme malnutrition, spread among the Romani children. Mengele ordered several prisoner doctors to observe the progression of the disease. Whereas any objective physician would have understood that the cause of noma was prolonged lack of food and poor hygiene, Mengele claimed that the origin of the condition lay in the congenital inferiority of the gypsy race. In his eagerness to supply material to research centers, several of these children were deliberately murdered. Their heads and organs were extracted and sent to the SS Medical Academy in Graz and to other Reich institutions, where they would be analyzed as anatomical study specimens. Tragically, even when the prisoner doctors found an effective treatment for the infection, which until then had been fatal in most cases, all the children who managed to recover were nonetheless sent to the gas chambers. The other major focus of his attention was identical twins. Since the 1930s, German geneticists, including his mentor Verschuer, had seen twins as a potential key to unlocking the secrets of heredity. In the years before the war, researchers required the consent of the parents or the children themselves to participate in studies which greatly limited the number of available cases. But Auschwitz removed all restrictions. Mengele had at his disposal hundreds of pairs of twins taken from the convoys of deported Jews and from Romani families imprisoned in the camp. No researcher in Germany or abroad had ever enjoyed such an abundance of human material. The selected twins were taken to the research complex, where the staff, under Mengele's orders, conducted exhaustive measurements of every part of their bodies. The shape of the skull, the length of the limbs, dental structure, iris pigmentation, and other characteristics were recorded. In addition, large quantities of biological samples, especially blood, were taken. Josef Mengele's record at Auschwitz was considered exemplary by his superiors within the SS, who spared no praise for his apparent dedication and efficiency in fulfilling his duties. This freedom and absolute backing allowed him to develop an extensive catalogue of medical experiments as cruel as they were aberrant, driven by his fanatical belief in the superiority of the Aryan race and his obsession with Nazi racial science. For these actions, he would ultimately be remembered by the sinister nickname, the Angel of Death. One of the most chilling episodes of his activity in the concentration camp occurred when Mengele selected two twins, barely 4 years old, Guido and Nina, under the pretext of subjecting them to a scientific procedure. They were taken to the operating room where, following his plan, the children were sewn together at the back. Their blood vessels were also connected in a macabre attempt to create artificial conjoined twins. When he left the operating room, the result revealed the limitless brutality of his mind. After the war, the survivor Vera Alexander painfully recounted the fate of the little ones. Their wounds were infected, they oozed constantly. They cried day and night without rest. Their mother, whose name I believe was Estella, managed to obtain some morphine and administered it to them so that they might finally find relief from their suffering. In another episode, a Jewish prisoner doctor stated that Mengele murdered 14 pairs of twins by injecting chloroform directly into the heart of one sibling from each pair. He then killed the surviving sibling as well, in order to compare their organs and study possible differences. Testimonies from those who worked near him consistently describe his contradictory nature. He was capable of appearing cordial, attentive, or even affectionate with the individuals he selected as research subjects. However, that facade would vanish in seconds. Without the slightest emotion, he would order their execution with the same ease as giving a routine instruction. To the children, in a perverse gesture, he asked to be called Uncle Mengele in order to gain their trust before turning them into victims of his experiments. Although much of his obsession focused on twins, the rest of the prisoners at Auschwitz were not spared from his practices. Mengele had a particular fascination with people who had physical malformations, chronic illnesses, or traits he considered worthy of study. In 1943, an outbreak of Noma, an aggressive bacterial infection that destroyed the face and mouth, spread among the Romani prisoners. Far from being concerned with the victims' health, Mengele saw the epidemic as an opportunity to conduct a study that he claimed would serve to develop a preventive treatment. However, any potential benefit was meant exclusively for Germans. To carry out these investigations, he forced the collaboration of Jewish pediatrician Berthold Epstein, a prisoner in the camp. The affected children who were not immediately killed were isolated in a special barrack. Many were deliberately executed so their heads and organs could be preserved in jars and sent to the SS Medical Academy for further analysis. One of his cruelest practices consisted of attempting to change the eye color of prisoners. To this end, he injected dyes and chemical substances directly into their eyeballs, causing unbearable pain and permanent injuries. Mengele also performed amputations without medical justification, experimental blood transfusions, and numerous invasive procedures whose sole purpose was to satisfy his pseudoscientific curiosity. Throughout his time at Auschwitz, Mengele maintained regular contact with his former mentor and benefactor, Ottmar von Verschuer. He sent him biological samples and tissue fragments from his victims to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where von Verschuer served as director. Some of his research in the camp was carried out expressly in the name of this institution. In a particularly atrocious case, Mengele ordered the murder of 8 members of a Romani family to extract their eyeballs and send them as comparative study material. In return, he received official letters of thanks for his tireless effort in service of German science. Despite holding the rank of chief physician, the medical care offered to prisoners under his supervision was virtually non-existent. The German medical staff limited themselves to observing and controlling the Jewish prisoner doctors who could barely provide basic care. Those requiring more advanced treatment were deemed useless and sent directly to the gas chambers. Ultimately, Josef Mengele's work at Auschwitz was characterized by a complete disregard for human life and a systematic use of medicine as a tool of extermination. His story became one of the most terrifying symbols of the Holocaust and a reminder of the horrors that can arise when ideological fanaticism and science are put at the service of hatred. When a typhus epidemic broke out in the women's sector of Auschwitz, Mengele ordered the complete evacuation of a barrack housing 600 Jewish prisoners. All were taken directly to the gas chambers and executed. Once the massacre was carried out, the building was disinfected and subjected to a thorough cleaning process. Afterward, the women from the neighboring block received clean clothing and were transferred to the newly sanitized barrack. This measure, which his superiors regarded as an example of efficiency and pragmatism, earned him the War Merit Cross. That same year, in 1944, Mengele was promoted to the position of first physician of Auschwitz-Birkenau. On a personal level, his life in the camp was relatively comfortable, especially compared to the harsh conditions endured by German troops on the fronts in Italy, Russia, or France, particularly after the Allied landings in Normandy. To maintain morale among SS officers, incentives such as extra food rations, cigarettes, and vodka were distributed whenever a mass killing was organized. In order to preserve a facade of bureaucratic formality, these gas executions were recorded in official documentation as special actions. Meanwhile, in the SS Officers' Club, lavish dinners were held that rivaled the best restaurants in Berlin. In that setting, Mengele and his wife Irene celebrated the birth of their son, Rolf, on the 11th of March of 1944. Just a few meters away, prisoners barely managed to survive on a caloric intake that rarely exceeded 700 calories per day. For most, the only uncertainty was how their suffering would end, whether from disease, starvation, the bullet of an impatient guard, or selection to become a human experiment. Auschwitz became the very paradigm of an extermination camp. Thousands of people were murdered daily, often as a direct result of the decisions made by Mengele and his so-called medical team. However, while the officers enjoyed their privileges, increasingly alarming news began to arrive. Allied bombers were devastating German cities without pause, and Western armies were advancing through France. Most troubling for those who remained at Auschwitz was that in 1944, the Soviet Red Army broke through the old Polish border and was quickly approaching the complex. At the same time, Waffen-SS units, including the Viking Division, continued fighting, while the regular army's morale and organization collapsed following the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on the 20th of July of 1944. Just 1 week later, an uprising broke out in Warsaw which, although crushed with extreme violence, made clear that German control over Poland was disintegrating. As a result, the massacres at Auschwitz intensified while Mengele continued his experiments. According to the diary of his wife on the 13th of September of 1944, air raid sirens were heard over the camp for the first time, an event that would be repeated many times during the final months of the war. Many of the procedures supervised by Mengele at Auschwitz stood out for their extreme brutality, completely lacking any legitimate medical purpose. These were invasive and painful interventions that, far from seeking relief or healing, aimed solely at experimental goals or the satisfaction of pseudoscientific curiosity. One case that clearly illustrates this perversion of medicine is that of Renate Gutmann, a child who, like so many others, was reduced to a number in the vast machinery of death. In the Auschwitz records, she was listed as prisoner 70,917. Upon arriving at the camp, she was torn without mercy from her mother's arms and separated from her brother. She was then taken to a building that functioned as a hospital, though its operations were more akin to a vivisection lab. There began an inhuman protocol to which twins were systematically subjected. Every part of their anatomy was meticulously measured. X-rays were taken, and large quantities of blood were extracted, not from an arm or a finger, but from the jugular vein in the neck. For a small child, this procedure inflicted a physical and psychological trauma difficult to describe. On one occasion, Renate was strapped to a table while a member of the medical team made a cut on her with a knife, without offering any explanation or comfort. Pain and terror were an essential part of the method. The goal was to subject the children not only to physical examination, but to the complete erasure of their will. The case of Laurent Menache, another survivor of the experiments, offers an equally harrowing testimony. Years later, she recalled with a trembling voice how prisoners were injected repeatedly in different parts of their bodies, without ever being informed about the nature of the substances. After one of those injections, her sister fell gravely ill. Her neck became so swollen that it was deformed, the result of an uncontrolled infection. Eventually, she was taken to the operating room, but what awaited her there bore no resemblance to any medical act worthy of the name. The procedure was carried out without anesthesia, in a filthy environment, lit by improvised lamps, with instruments that were barely cleaned between one procedure and the next. Years later, Lorenz would describe that place as a slaughterhouse disguised as an operating room, where human life held no value and suffering was met with indifference. In the hands of Josef Mengele, science lost all connection to ethics and was transformed into an instrument of degradation, torture, and extermination, wrapped in the language of biomedical research but completely stripped of humanity. Among the most atrocious experiments Mengele conducted on twins were amputations without medical justification, deliberate inoculation of typhus or similar diseases in one of the siblings, and blood transfusions from one twin to the other, often to the point of inducing shock. The testimony of Vera Alexander recounts perhaps one of the most chilling episodes. Mengele attempted to create Siamese twins by surgically sewing two Romani children together at the back. The experiment, as expected, led to unspeakable suffering. Both children died of gangrenous infection after several days of agony. The victims who perished during these experiments were only a part of the deadly toll. Those who survived with permanent injuries were systematically killed as soon as Mengele deemed them no longer useful. The corpses were dissected for study purposes, turned into objects of research. Miklos Niesli, a Jewish doctor who was forced to collaborate with Mengele, recounted how, in a single night, the SS officer personally executed 14 pairs of twins with chloroform injections directly into their hearts. If one twin died from illness, the other was immediately sacrificed so comparative autopsies could be performed. Once the reports were completed, certain organs were packaged and sent to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. During the selections on the Auschwitz-Birkenau ramp, Mengele not only identified twins, He also examined with morbid interest deportees with physical abnormalities. Individuals with dwarfism, gigantism, bone malformations, or clubfoot were immediately separated from the rest. His experiments included exhaustive anthropometric measurements, repeated blood extraction, the removal of perfectly healthy teeth, and exposure to radiation and drugs designed not to heal but to provoke observable changes. Once the study was completed, the victims were killed. Their bodies, often mutilated, were sent to Germany to support the research of other Reich scientists. Elisabeth Ovitz, a woman with dwarfism who survived these atrocities, confessed with a trembling voice late in her life that it was impossible to describe the unbearable pain they inflicted on us. A suffering that continued for days, even after the experiments had ceased. Another of Mengele's obsessions was prisoners with heterochromia, a genetic trait where a person has each eye a different color. A colleague of his at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute had a particular interest in this condition. Mengele ordered the identification and murder of deportees who displayed it in order to extract their eyeballs, which were preserved in jars before being sent to Berlin. In his laboratory, Mengele created one of his most macabre collections, dozens and dozens of human eyes carefully pierced and nailed onto wooden boards. These remains, which he observed like an entomologist studying dissected insects, he chillingly referred to as my butterfly collection. Most of those subjected to Josef Mengele's medical experiments were children. Paradoxically, this doctor who embodied the brutality of Nazism often appeared attentive and even cordial to the little ones he selected as research material. These minors were housed in barracks separate from the rest of the prisoners, where, compared to the camp's inhuman conditions, they received slightly more nutritious food and less violent treatment. Moshe Offer, one of the few survivors of these experiments, recalled many years later Mengele's contradictory behavior. According to his account, he would approach the children with friendly gestures, like that uncle everyone likes, carrying pieces of chocolate or small gifts that he handed out with a reassuring smile. Before subjecting them to invasive procedures, he would murmur comforting words, "Don't be afraid, nothing will happen to you." But reality soon followed. Injections of unknown substances, surgical incisions, and extractions of fluids or tissues. Moshe remembered that his brother Tibi was subjected to particularly cruel operations. Mengele operated on his spinal column without anesthesia and later, in another series of experiments, inserted pins into their heads for purposes the children never understood. The marks from those pinpricks are still visible, Moshe would say many years later. The tragedy culminated on the day Tibi was taken away and returned several days later with his head completely bandaged. Shortly thereafter, he died in his brother's arms. Mengele did not only use children for his own research, he also assigned them to collaborate on projects promoted by the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. One of these lines of study aimed to modify eye color. To do this, chemical reagents were injected directly into the eyeballs of children and infants, with consequences ranging from severe inflammation and burns to irreversible blindness and even death. Hungarian gynecologist Gisela Perl, a prisoner forced to assist in the camp hospital, described Mengele's absolute coldness in the face of his victim's agony. After one of many executions, she saw him calmly take a perfumed soap from his pocket, whistle a cheerful tune, and wash his hands with a satisfied gesture as if he had just completed a trivial task, not committed a murder. Another prisoner tasked with attending to the Jewish twins selected for these experiments detailed the children's physical and emotional reactions. Blood extractions began in the fingers and ended in the arteries and could be repeated 2 or 3 times in a single day. Terror took hold of them. They screamed, curled up trying to shield themselves from being touched, but SS personnel ultimately restrained them by force. In other cases, chemical drops were administered into their eyes. Some received the liquid in both eyes, others in only one, to compare effects. The result was unbearable suffering. Their eyelids would swell grotesquely, and a burning sensation made them cry for hours. Alex Deckel, another survivor, directly witnessed atrocities beyond comprehension. He recalled in horror how Mengele performed surgical procedures without any anesthesia, removing hearts and stomachs from living prisoners while other captives were forced to watch. For his part, Yitzhak Ganon, a Greek-born Jew deported to Auschwitz at the age of 20, testified in 2009 that Mengele removed one of his kidneys without administering painkillers. That act of sadism did not end with the operation. After surgery, he was forced to return to hard labor, weak and in such extreme pain that he could barely stand. These practices were not isolated incidents, but part of a system that legitimized cruelty under the pretext of scientific research. For Mengele and those who collaborated with him, Jewish and Romani children were not human beings with dignity and rights, but mere objects of experimentation. That perversion of medicine stands as one of the darkest chapters of the Holocaust. Mengele also focused part of his experiments on pregnant women, whom he subjected to cruel procedures before sending them in many cases to planned death. One victim of these practices was Ruth Elias, a Czech Jew who arrived at Auschwitz from the Theresienstadt ghetto while expecting a child. Decades later, she painfully recounted how she gave birth to a robust, fair-haired girl who immediately caught Mengele's attention. With cold curiosity, he ordered that Ruth's breasts be bound, claiming he wanted to observe how long a newborn can survive without nourishment. For several days, the mother watched helplessly as her daughter agonized, until a fellow Czech prisoner doctor offered her a syringe loaded with a lethal dose of morphine to end the baby's suffering. Another survivor, Dr. Olga Lengyel, described how Mengele attended the deliveries of prisoner women with meticulous attention, observing every detail with almost clinical interest. However, once the birth was over, the outcome did not differ from that reserved for others. After examining the newborn, Mengele ordered that both mother and child be taken without delay to the gas chamber. On other occasions, his sadism surpassed any imaginable limit. It is known that on one occasion he forcibly removed a baby from its mother's womb. Upon realizing that it was not a twin birth, as he had expected, he threw the newborn into a lit furnace with a gesture of disdain, frustrated that the birth had not met his expectations. The end and escape of the Angel of Death. In January of 1945, as Soviet troops began their unstoppable advance through Poland, Mengele fled Auschwitz along with other members of the SS staff. During the final months of the war, he was assigned to the Gross Rosen concentration camp and several of its subcamps. As the Third Reich collapsed, he disguised himself in a Wehrmacht, regular German army, uniform and joined a unit that, at the end of the conflict, surrendered to the American occupation forces. Under this false identity, Mengele was registered as a prisoner of war. But at that time, the American authorities were unaware of the extent of his crimes, and his name had not yet been fully identified among the most wanted. In early August of 1945, he was released, with no suspicion that the officer in question was directly responsible for thousands of deaths and horrific experiments. During the next 4 years, Mengele lived a clandestine existence. He lived under a false name near Rosenheim, Bavaria, where he worked as a farm laborer. From there, he managed to maintain contact with his family, who helped him survive and plan his escape. When the Allied authorities began to thoroughly document the horrors of Auschwitz and discovered Mengele's involvement, they began a search for him. However, thanks to false statements made by his relatives, investigators were led to believe he had died. Those initial failed investigations convinced Mengele that remaining in Germany was no longer safe. With financial backing from his wealthy family, he managed to flee to South America. In July of 1949, he sailed to Argentina under another identity. There he found an environment where many Nazis had already taken refuge. During the 1950s, he felt secure enough to regularize his status. In 1956, he obtained Argentine citizenship under the name Josef Mengele. But in 1959, his apparent tranquility was shattered. By the end of the 1950s, judicial authorities in West Germany had compiled a voluminous case file documenting in detail the crimes committed by Josef Mengele. Arrest warrants multiplied, and his name now appeared among the most wanted war criminals in Europe. Upon learning that his arrest was imminent, Mengele chose to flee once again. This time, he set his sights on Paraguay, where he ensured he obtained citizenship that would offer him greater freedom of movement and a new legal shield against possible extraditions. But that fragile sense of security would not last long. In May of 1960, the world was stunned when agents of the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, succeeded in locating the chief architect of the final solution, Adolf Eichmann, in Buenos Aires and abducted him to bring him to Jerusalem. The operation, closely followed internationally, triggered alarms throughout the network of former Nazis hiding in South America. Mengele, convinced that his own capture was only a matter of time, fell into panic. Without much thought, he abruptly left Paraguay. Thanks to the continued financial support of his family, which never withdrew its backing, he managed to settle in Brazil. There, under a false identity, he found shelter in a rural area near Sao Paulo. For years he lived discreetly, alternating periods of hiding with stays in homes provided by sympathizers and accomplices. In 1977, his son, Rolf Mengele, traveled from Germany to Brazil to visit him. The meeting between them was revealing. Rolf encountered an elderly man, visibly aged and worn down, but who remained entirely convinced of his innocence. According to later accounts, his father was unmoved by the listing of his crimes and stated with complete calm that he had never personally caused any harm. In his view, everything he had done was a loyal fulfillment of the duties imposed by his rank in the SS. The existence of the Angel of Death came to an end on February 7, 1979. That day, while swimming off the coast of Bertioga, a vacation town near Sao Paulo, he suffered a stroke. Unable to stay afloat, he drowned before anyone could rescue him. His body was buried under the alias Wolfgang Gerhard in a cemetery on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, a final attempt to erase his trace and elude the justice that had pursued him for more than 3 decades. Thus ended the life of the man who most clearly embodied the absolute perversion of science, turned into an instrument of extermination. For 34 years he managed to evade governments, prosecutors, and survivors demanding accountability. No one mourned his death. The name Josef Mengele became forever etched in history as a synonym for the horror of Auschwitz and the use of medicine to inflict suffering beyond any conceivable limit of humanity.